the chairman of our session here on the COVID-19 crisis and the impacts for Southern, Eastern, and probably also Western Europe. And we have 4 panelists today with short presentations. So I think every panelist should present between 10 and 15 minutes. And then I think we have sufficient time also to discuss any questions from the audience. So yeah, then I think without further ado, we can just proceed with Sonia Huderek-Glabska from the Poznan University of Economics and Business. And we look very much forward to your presentation, Sonia. So the floor is yours. Move on to our second speaker in our panel. So if there are any further questions from the audience to Sonia, I think we can also summarize and discuss at the end of the panel. So at least from my side, thank you very much for your presentation so far. And now I call Andreas Papatheodorou to our floor here, virtual floor, and he will give us a bit of an overview also on the tourist perspective, I believe, in the southeastern European countries. So Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. Hope you can all see my screen. Okay, so I really enjoyed Sonia's presentation, which was more on airlines and airports. My approach is slightly different because I'm going to focus more on systemic and policy issues, discussing the implications of aviation and regional development in Southern Europe. And as you all know, when we talk about the relationship between aviation and regional development, there are effectively 2 main drivers. One is related to tourism, and the other is related to cargo. And as in the case of Central and Eastern European countries, that's also the case for Southern Europe when we talk about the relationship regarding aviation and regional development is essentially related to tourism. Okay, so let me just highlight this relationship a bit further. Just a few things in terms of theory. Usually we refer to a tourism ratio, so that's about the tourism-related receipts of a specific sector expressed as a percentage of its total turnover. When this ratio is over 15%, usually that particular sector is regarded as being part of the tourism industry. And usually we argue that air transport has a ratio often exceeding 90%. Remember, when we talk about tourism, it's not only leisure tourism, it's business tourism, visiting friends and relatives, and so on. And the 2 sectors are structurally interrelated. The demand for air transport is essentially a derived one because very few people fly for the sake of flying. Most people fly to go somewhere and do something. Just to give you some statistics, about 57% of international tourists traveled by air in 2018 compared to 35% in 1980. And again, air transport is quite important also in terms of generation of jobs. So when we consider direct employment effects, that's 15.6 million jobs. When we consider the total effect, that's 36.7 million jobs, close to $900 billion in terms of GDP. Now, obviously, these statistics were before COVID-19, and we also need to remember that for several Southeastern European countries, the percentage of international tourists who arrived by air is much higher. So if, for example, we talk about Cyprus, that's almost 100%. If we talk about Malta, that's more or less the same. For Greece, it's over 70%, and it's only Spain where the percentage is slightly smaller because they have a good road connections to France and other European countries as well. So all these things are quite important, and what we've seen over the last couple of decades is more and more emphasis in what we call route development. So this has emerged as a top priority for airlines, airports, and destination managers. And until the emergence of the pandemic, most people were predominantly focusing on ensuring that sustainability objectives would be met. And the the very important thing is tourism. In tourism is to ensure that destinations do not become a victim of their own success. And therefore, the idea is that, yes, we do need improved transport accessibility, but at the same time, we need to consider per capita tourism receipts also in a sustainable context. And then, as we all know, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, definitely what we call a black swan. So in economics, financial economics, we use this term to refer to events that are very unlikely to happen, but when they do happen, they usually have a devastating effect. So as a result of this black swan, we moved from a narrative of over-tourism, and here you can see a nice picture from the very popular island of Santorini in Greece, where lots of people are packing to enjoy the scenery and wait for the sunset as well. Many of them used to be Chinese tourists, but we used to get tourists from all over the world visiting Santorini. And then from over tourism, we went down to zero tourism. This is a picture shot on the 28th of March outside the Colosseum in Rome, as part during the first lockdown. As you probably know, most European countries are now about or have already entered the second lockdown, as for example, the case of Greece. Here I quote some statistics coming from the ETC, the European Travel Commission, published a few days ago, which summarized the collapse of international tourism arrivals in Europe in 2020. And what I highlight here are several South European countries. So as you can see, percentages range between 60-65%, but in some cases they are much more severe. So in the case of Cyprus, for example, the percentage was almost 85%. In the case of Greece, 78%. Again, it's all these statistics are not directly comparable because they relate to different regions. For example, in the case of Greece, that's between January and June, whereas in the case of Croatia, for example, is between January and September. Same case for Slovenia, or in the case of Portugal, is up to August. But I think that you all get the idea that we experience very substantial decreases in terms of international tourism arrivals. Now, if we are to talk more specifically about transport, these statistics were released yesterday by IATA during, sorry, that was on Wednesday by IATA on a workshop related to air transport and the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic for Greece. Now, statistics here are slightly better because they do take into consideration the entire period until mid-September. So as we can see, Greece fared better compared to what we saw previously. And why was this the case? Because country did take the pandemic very seriously, introduced a very strict lockdown during the first period, that's March and April, and this seems to have had some positive branding effects. So a number of tourists decided to visit Greece and other countries as well during summertime. So at least in terms of airline passengers, and focusing on Europe here, the situation does not look as bad as previously. Having said that, it's far from good. At best, we experience reductions of close to 50%, but as we also saw previously, and also related to a number of countries here as well, things started deteriorating again from August onwards. Greece entered a second lockdown last week, so obviously we are about to experience a second wave of collapse. Now here we have a great graph coming from a Morningstar DBRS report published in September, which shows the vulnerability of different countries, different European countries to tourism. And undoubtedly, Southern European countries are very heavily reliant on tourism. When you see a red color, that's a bad thing because it shows a high degree of vulnerability, whereas when you see a green number, that's a good thing because it shows a relatively low degree of vulnerability. So as you can see, we have a number of different pillars, including contribution of tourism to GDP, percentage of tourism employment as a share of total employment, travel balance, foreign tourism spending, what happens in terms of employment as well, seasonality in terms of tourism employability, educational skills in tourism, and the overall travel and tourism competitiveness index coming from WEF, World Economic Forum. So here we can see that Greece tops the list. It seems to be the most vulnerable country according to this Morningstar report, because Greece heavily relies on tourism, and as we said earlier, more than 70% of international tourist arrivals in Greece are generated by air. And on top of that, tourism is a major employment generator in Greece. And unfortunately, many of these jobs are of seasonal nature, and some of them relate to relatively low employment skills as well. So as you can see, Greece tops the list with an overall assessment carried out by DBRS Morningstar of 1.3, followed by Cyprus, Malta, Portugal, Spain, Italy. So all these countries are part of what we call Southern Europe. Slovenia is slightly better, and this is in sharp contrast to what we see for Northern European countries like Germany or Belgium or Finland. Obviously, they did experience a recession as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but much of this tourism has not suffered. We need to consider that, for example, in Germany, there is a good number of tourists who are actually domestic tourists. Domestic tourism in Germany is quite strong. I would say that's also the case in France or elsewhere in Northern Europe. And on top of that, very few Northern European countries rely heavily on tourism. They do rely on services, but on other type of services like banking services, merchandise, and obviously they do have a much stronger industrial base compared to Southern European countries. So from a tourism point of view, yes, we can say that countries all over Europe and all over the world have suffered, but predominantly it seems to be a major problem for Southern European countries. And that has to be somehow put together with the rise of debt. And I would say that rise of debt is not only for Southern European countries, as you can see in this table here, that relates to the entire euro area. So in 2019, the general government gross debt in the euro area was 84%, and it's expected to jump to 101% in 2020. Problem, though, is that some Southern European countries whose finances were not in a good shape before the crisis are expected to see an exacerbation of the situation. So if we talk about Greece, in 2019, the general gross debt of the government was 180%, expected to rise to 205% in 2020 and to 200% in 2021. That's only second after Japan, but we need to consider that Japan is a very big economy. Most of its debt is owned by Japanese citizens, so it's a different story. And it's not only Greece. We also see a massive rise of debt for Italy from 144% expected to rise to 161. Also the case for Portugal, also the case for Spain. Now, what is perhaps a bit strange is that all these countries that I've just mentioned currently are in a position to borrow money with negative interest rates, or with a very, very low interest rates, depending on what benchmark we use. But I suppose that this only happens because the European Central Bank has been very, very generous, and essentially it's raining money during this period in Europe. But at some stage, I think that this extra loose monetary policy cannot be sustained forever. At some stage, it is highly likely to result in inflationary pressures. So had we not considered this issue, things would have been okay. But as a result of these very high debt levels, if they are to become sustainable in the longer term, I think that great measures need to be taken, not only in terms of an ultra lax monetary policy, but in terms of streamlining tourism policies in order to get tourism back on track in Southern Europe, and also to invest in infrastructural projects and possibly have an expansionary fiscal policy, but from a supply-led point of view, not just giving money away. So coming to my last line, which is essentially about summarizing and concluding on the future of aviation and regional development issues in Southern Europe. Of course, at present, it's quicksand. There are several uncertainties which undermine the future of aviation tourism sector. Obviously, the big thing is how long will the pandemic last? What will be the severity levels? As you all know, earlier this week and last week, we had major announcements regarding progress in the vaccine domain. But having said that, at the same time, many countries are still about to enter or have already entered the second lockdown phase. So people are more optimistic, but at present the situation is really grave, I would say. And on top of that, we need to remember about recession. So far, it has been quite substantial. We haven't seen much of the effects so far, possibly because of the ultra lax monetary policy. But as I said, that's not going to last forever. So knowing the depth and the length of the global recession is quite important. Knowing how long the different lockdowns and travel restrictions are going to be is also very important. And again, it's a matter of consumer confidence and whether air transport companies, and that's not only for airlines, it's predominantly for airlines, but it's also for airports, possibly ground handlers, caterers, and so on, whether they can withstand the current financial adversity. So as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the very fact that so far different countries have responded in a rather uncoordinated way, we've seen an exacerbation of the north-south divide. So that might create some worrying conditions for a systemic economic crisis, especially because, as I said earlier, many Southern European countries are vulnerable in terms of tourism, and their economies are debt-ridden. And obviously, this may have very negative implications, not only for aviation, travel, and tourism, but for the wider regional development process in Europe. So what we need to do in the immediate and short term, I think, is to somehow streamline responses vis-à-vis COVID-19 testing, travel restrictions at an international level. Of course, global coordination is difficult to achieve, but at least at the level of the European Union, things need to be done. We have already seen some measures introduced by European Union in October, but most industrial bodies seem to believe that there is room for substantial improvement in terms of streamlining, because otherwise it's going to be very, very difficult to have a proper recovery of tourism while we're waiting for a cure of a disease, or at least a vaccine. And at the same time, we need to consider social distancing. So revenue management is going to be very much affected by social distancing, by the very fact that people do not want to be as crowded as they used to be. As you all know, at some stage, there were some thoughts about leaving middle seats empty in aircraft. Obviously, that could not prove sustainable from a financial point of view, but perhaps this may raise interesting thoughts in terms of the destination management model, because so far we've seen different revenue management models applied for airlines, for hotels, for airports, for other parts of the tourism industry. However, not so much in the context of a destination. So I think that what I mentioned earlier, the very idea of ensuring that some destinations do not become victims of their own success somehow re-emerges. I think that some sustainable tourist development is still very much part of the agenda. It's not only valid, it should also be somehow prioritized. And then it's a matter of bringing together the different air transport stakeholders with destination stakeholders in order to ensure that this development will prove sustainable and as smooth as possible. So that's all from me. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas, for this perspective on the current situation. So I think it's also a very concise, very interesting overview with a special focus on the situation in tourism. So thank you for this. So do we have questions from the audience? So maybe as the audience still prepares some questions, a question from my side. So you mentioned that currently the European Central Bank has a bit of a very relaxed monetary policy, lots of money available in the market. But how is the current situation in the Southern European countries? So are there any larger programs going on supporting the tourism industry with public money? And maybe you can also tell a little bit about the situation of airlines in Southern Europe, like for instance, Aegean.
Thank you, Wolfgang. That's a very interesting question. So as I said earlier, borrowing money is not a big problem today, even for Southern European countries. At the same time, everybody is expecting the recovery fund. And the idea is that the European Recovery Fund is going to be to play a major role in terms of financing infrastructural projects, including projects related to transport. So I think the emphasis from now on will not be on the monetary policy, will be more on infrastructure projects, including those that can help transport and tourism. Now, regarding casualties, so far, and in line with what Sonia said earlier, I don't think we've seen any major bankruptcies. Having said that, I know that a number of carriers, facing big issues, and they currently rely on or expect to rely on kind of support. Obviously, the big issue was with Alitalia, and as we all know, Alitalia had huge problems, and I think the Italian state found a good opportunity now to renationalize the company. There have been issues with TAP Portugal, but I think that so far the situation is somehow under control. Iberia is part of IAG, so they jointly deal with BA about the problems. Aegean Airlines is a very interesting example because it was a cash-rich carrier, and in February, shortly before the big blow, they announced a major expansion of the fleet, and there was a very big ceremony here in Athens. And unfortunately, all the plans were somehow suspended because of the pandemic. They currently burn a lot of money in order to keep the company afloat and keep flying, but obviously this cannot go ahead forever. So at some stage, we would either need to see some stronger support from different Southern European states, or at least to see a good level of recovery. Otherwise, sorry to say that the situation for Southern European airlines is not good either. For airports, it's slightly different because many of them are state-owned. Some of them are owned by or managed by concessionaires. For example, in Greece, Fraport Greece manages 14 airports. They had a great year in 2019. Obviously, the results for 2020 are slightly disappointing, but we're looking forward to a bright 2021. Let's hope so.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. So any further questions from our audience?
I have one question. I mean, I thought that the tourism industry has some high hopes in these rapid tests. And now we have, I think there was the first ship now from the US to the Caribbean, the Sea Dream 1, and now they found some positive cases there, which is now sort of, now there is some big trouble there again.
Mm-hmm.
So do you know anything about the use and the effective use of these rapid tests and how they perhaps can help the tourism industry in Greece, Southern Europe, or basically anywhere? But are there any experiences that you can report?
Well, thank you, Akim. That's a great question, and we're all looking forward to reliable rapid tests, because my understanding is that rapid tests are there, but they're not always reliable. So as we all know from statistics, there are two types of errors. Either you are positive in COVID-19 and you are reported as negative, or you are negative and you are reported as positive. And my understanding is that at present, rapid tests seem to suffer from both type 1 and type 2 errors. So we're trying to use them as much as possible, but at the same time, reliability is an issue. A number of carriers ask people to provide a proper, not a rapid test, a proper test showing that they're negative COVID-19, but they have 72 hours before they fly to do so, which means that if in the meantime went to a COVID party, that wouldn't make much sense. So as I said earlier, I think that streamlining is of greatest importance here. Fragmentation is not good, and fragmentation also may be a vested way to talk about protectionism. A number of European countries this year introduced the very concept of staycation. They asked the people to stay at home to enjoy domestic tourism, which does make sense from a hygiene and health and safety point of view. But at the same time, we need to remember that international tourism is essential about broaden the outlook, and Southern Europe is very heavily dependent on the tourism coming from countries like Germany or France or Nordic countries and so on. So streamlining is very, very important, together with any test procedures to ensure that we can somehow recover before we end up having a second big economic and debt-related crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick one? Sorry, can I ask a quick question?
Yes, please. Please go ahead.
How are you, Andreas?
Hi, David.
Yeah, just a quick one. I wondered whether there was any evidence of Southern European countries trying to put together as destinations packages for part relocation or some form of relocation for families from other European countries. I mean, in the UK, we've certainly seen a little bit of a trend of people no longer wanting or needing to stay so close to city centres and wanting more space. And it just seems like perhaps a little bit of an opportunity for Southern European countries, as we go through these waves of lockdowns and uncertainty, to look for ways to rebalance things in these types of ways. I mean, in my focus area in the Caribbean, there was a couple of incentives from places like Barbados and St. Lucia recently for people to try and relocate partly, presumably, rather than fully, to these locations with attractive packages of residency, stroke, good offers for apartments and so on and so forth. Are you aware of any sort of push for this at all in Southern
Thank
Europe?
you, David. That's very, very interesting. And well, interestingly, a number of European countries, Southern European countries, developed a kind of golden visa program, even before the COVID-19 crisis. So the idea was to attract people not from Northern Europe, but predominantly from Asia Pacific, and the idea was to get into countries like Greece or Cyprus or Malta, and invest in real estate in order to be given privileges of residency. And this program seems to have continued. Of course, some people are reluctant, some others may find it a good idea. At the same time, we need to remember that remoteness and social distancing is a good thing, but at the same time, it's maybe also related to lack of medical infrastructure. So, for example, there are many islands in Greece which are completely COVID-19 free. They never experience a single case. But at the same time, the medical infrastructure there is rather poor. So if you go and if something happens to you, then it might be difficult for you to find a solution. Okay, the government might introduce some measures to take you back to the mainland, but in the presence of a second lockdown, that may not be easy. So what we need to consider is that social distancing is important. Having this kind of packages is important, but unless you somehow supplement it with proper health and medical infrastructure, it may lead to a kind of a disappointment. So to cut it short, well, yes, okay, Greece, other countries have tried to attract people, saying that we dealt with COVID-19 crisis during March or April quite well. And indeed, we did get some people who came in July and August, but most people went back home. I don't think that it's easy to have a proper incentivization package at present, largely because, as I said, it's not only about incentivizing people, it's also a matter of medical infrastructure that needs to be there as well.
Okay, thank you. So I think we should move on to our third panelist here, Manuel Wehner from the University of Applied Sciences in Frankfurt. And you will still have the chance to ask also Andreas some questions in our final round at the end of the panel.